Hi, YouTube. My name is Dr. Daniel Kaplan, and my mission is to make psychology accessible to all. In today's video, we're going to talk about various risk factors for mental illness. But without further ado, let's get into it. So you might ask yourself, what are some factors that affect the rates and expression of psychopathology? So the first thing we're going to talk about is poverty and socioeconomic disadvantage. If we look at large-scale data, we see that 1 in 5 children in the United States, as well as 1 in 8 children in Canada, live in poverty. And as I mentioned in previous videos, that poverty creates unique stressors, and stress is the universal trigger to mental illness. If we look at ethnic variations, Native American or First Nations, Latino and Black children are at the greatest risk of poverty and socioeconomic disadvantage. As I mentioned, poverty and socioeconomic disadvantage result in mental illness. So you might say, well, what are the common diagnoses that we see? We see children who come from poor and disadvantaged families have higher rates of conduct disorders, chronic illness, school issues, emotional disorders, and cognitive/learning difficulties. So that's poverty. We also have to understand the impact of sex and gender differences. And one of the things that I will tell you is that members of the LGBTQIA community face multiple challenges that affect their health and well-being. Things like prejudice, discrimination, bias, hate crimes, and so forth result in unique stressors. Now, children of various genders express their mental health concerns in different ways. And we'll talk about males and females and some differences we see as it relates to mental illnesses, but we'll get there. Now, when we talk about gender, we don't view gender as binary. So it's not just male or female. There are a whole host of other gender identifications, and it's along a spectrum and can be quite fluid. Now, we do see that sex differences related to behavioral concerns do increase with age. So I said there are differences between males and females. When it comes to externalizing behaviors, such as conduct disorder, such as bullying, such as any form of aggression, we're going to see that males have higher rates than females, especially in preschool and early elementary school. What's interesting is that the rates of externalizing disorders converge between males and females. Both males and females drop in terms of externalizing disorders with age, but you'll see if we look at the graph, the first panel on the right, you see the red and the blue start to converge, almost identical. So by the age of 18, there's negligible differences between males and females on externalizing behavior. Whereas when it comes to internalizing problems, things like depression and anxiety, we see that for females, the rates increase with age, and through time, females are at significantly higher rate of externalizing disorders relative to males. Now let's talk about race and ethnicity. When we talk about race and ethnicity, we typically view this as a socially constructed phenomenon. And in fact, a lot of the categories we have related to race and ethnicity can be tracked to the 1500s forward as a way of either classifying, categorizing, and ultimately creating power differentials between the various race and ethnicities. Now, there remains a significant barrier to access to care, quality of care, and we see differential outcomes for children who come from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. And that's important to note that there isn't a single tier of healthcare. We one of the criticisms we have is there might be a two-tier model. People who have higher socioeconomic status tend to have greater access to care. People who are in lower socioeconomic status tend to have lesser access to care. And because we said ethnic minorities have higher rates of poverty and disenfranchisement, we do see that there are health barriers or mental health barriers there. So if we look at the models of treatment as well, the early models of mental health treatment were validated with a Eurocentric model. And it's only in the 1970s forward that we start to see a shift back towards inclusion, where we try and understand cultural value systems that are non-Eurocentric, and we start to develop identity development models that incorporate traditions, beliefs, value systems of more culturally diverse groups. This has been on a steady incline since the 1970s. And there is a strong emphasis today on diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I would argue that the focus started much earlier than today. And we've come a long way, but there's certainly more that we need to do. Now, what happens when a person feels marginalized? They start to feel alienated. They might have poor social cohesion, and they might feel rejected relative to their peers. So when we talk about culture, what is culture? Culture is a set of either explicit or implicit values, beliefs, and practices that characterize a group. Now, one's culture can affect how we react to a child's problem, how one's problems manifest, and so forth. And what I would say is, when we think of cultural competence, it's very important that we operate from more of a transcultural psychiatry model, a more individualized model, so that we're not taking the mindset of one group or culture and superimposing it on another group. Now, trauma. Trauma is also a risk factor for mental illness, and we see that at least 1 in 7 children have experienced some form of child abuse or neglect in 2020. And 1/3, or a little bit more than 1/3, of people between the ages of 10 to 16 have experienced either physical or sexual assault. And we have a term that measures various traumas. So we refer to it as adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and we can track the number of adverse childhood experiences with physical health problems as well as mental illness and substance abuse. And in addition to mental health concerns, it does affect one's learning, occupational status, earning potential, and so forth. So trauma is a big hindrance to the development of children. Now let's talk about adolescents. Teenagers have their own unique stressors, and one of the biggest stressors that teenagers face is trying to figure out who they are. And I like to talk about your first day of high school. Imagine, go back to your first day of high school. and what was the most stressful period of the day, you would likely say lunch. And going to lunch seems like, well, you're not in a class, you get to relax. But what happens is people get put in a massive cafeteria with a sea of other people. And now you have a stressful decision. Where do you sit? And who do you sit with? And what group of people do you belong to? So it's trial and error. People sit at different tables and eventually they find their group, but it's stressful. Now, so in addition to figuring out, who our friend groups are, we have to figure out what our own value systems are and who we want to date in terms of romantic history and whatnot. And similar to the way teenagers will try different tables out to figure out who they are, there's an increased risk of a whole host of risky behavior, whether it be drugs or sex or speeding. When people get their license, it's not uncommon for teenagers to race down the freeway. And these are unique stressors for teenagers. And one of the things that I always recommend is that we tailor our treatment when we're working with teenagers to their unique stressors. Now, lifespan. Lifespan, when we talk about the lifespan, that is your development prenatally all the way till death. That's what we mean. But when we think of prenatal development all the way to death, having all these potential risk factors for mental illness means that it is possible that a person can struggle with mental illness for a long period of time. And it can go untreated for a significant period of time. And if it goes untreated, it doesn't just magically go away. The vast majority of severe and persistent mental illness requires intentional treatment. But without treatment, it's going to affect one's friendships. It's going to affect one's schooling. It's going to affect one's romantic partners and so forth. And we know that about 20% of children with these severe and chronic disorders struggle across their lifespan. People who don't get treatment and have severe and persistent mental illness are the least likely to finish school. And if you don't finish school, that is basically a sentence for poverty. And more often than not, people subsist, they struggle, they might engage in illegal activities for the sake of just surviving. So, having an untreated mental illness has a whole host of factors, like I said, and it's a cascade. You don't finish school, could result in lower socioeconomic status, a life of poverty, increased stressors, might engage in more illegal activities and so forth. And we also see that children who have severe and persistent mental illness, at least 1 in 5, they're actually the most likely to have social problems. So as it relates to one's peers and getting along with others, this is a significant concern. And the moral of the story, if I were going to say the punchline, is that we really need to treat mental health concerns early. And if there is a child showing warning signs, treat it early, because if not, it's almost like a hole in a garment. And the longer you don't address the hole, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And practically speaking, it affects the child. It affects these children when they become adults. It affects all the people around these children. So the lifelong consequences associated with childhood psychopathology are costly, emotionally, physically, financially, and so forth. And that is my brief lesson on what are some of the factors that affect the rates of expressive psychopathology. And in recap, we talked about things like poverty and socioeconomic status. We talked about gender differences and the experiences of members of the LGBT community. We talked about race and ethnicity. We talked about culture and how we have to modify our approach to treatment that is culturally sensitive. We talked about child abuse, neglect, and maltreatment, and the concept of adverse childhood experiences. And we talked about the cost of not addressing mental health in childhood, the lifelong or lifespan implications. That, in a nutshell, is what I wanted to accomplish today. If you found this video meaningful, hit the like button, subscribe, click the notifications tab. This will allow me to bring this video to a larger audience because YouTube is all about analytics, and these are ways that they know that this is of some value. Also, if you have any thoughts or reaction, please put it in the comment section. I read and respond to all comments. If you have a question, also drop it in the comments. And or if there's anything that stood out to you, also feel free to put in the comments. But until next time, take care, everybody. Be well.